Oh, man. Okay. So future me, if you're watching, you could maybe start editing here. Let's see how many people we get. Let me tie my shoes real quick. Okay. Brian Wesley Williams. Okay, we got 2 people watching. How's it going, Brian? There we go. Okay. Man, I have some connectivity issues, which I did not expect. But I can see some people dropped already. Stream some of them. I haven't done this in a while. I think it's been since last year that I did a live stream. Did it in the rehearsal room, played a little bit of guitar. Decided today to take everyone out with me into nature here in Austin, Texas. It's kind of crazy because I haven't been on these trails for a while. Definitely not since the ice storm. Maybe you heard about that if you watch American news, the Austin ice storm. But basically, ice froze onto all the tree limbs. We've got really like heavy tree cover all over the city, and basically tree limbs snapped, whole trees went down all over the city. It took up power all across Austin for like 4 or 5 days. Not all across, but it was like at one point like 70% of the customers didn't have power. Anyway, going out here on these trails now, there's all these back trails that I know that not everyone knows about. There's like a main trail that they keep pretty well cleared, and then there's trails that just kind of go off up into the hills. And I found today most of them that I tried are like impassable because they're just covered with like downed trees, and like you're already at a gradient going up the side of the hill on like a really narrow pathway where it's like a drop. It's not like a mountain or anything, but you would break some bones, potentially die if you fell down this a hill out here on the Greenbelt. And there's just like a whole tree suddenly on the path that's blocking you. So, I don't think the city's going to be cleaning up any of these back trails anywhere anytime soon. So I think I'm SOL for some of my, more secret hidden bypaths that I like to go sneak off to out here for alone time. And, that's what I get for not coming out here as much in recent months and days. But hey, I've been working on the podcast. So, I've been trying to get out into nature more often. I used to come out here a lot, 3 or 4 days a week when I was really into Zen and Buddhism, when I was having my spiritual crisis or whatever, and come out and meditate in the woods. And it was great in some respects. It was a whole new source of like entertainment, like spiritual entertainment, you could say. I think that's what a lot of meditation does for people is like, hey, if you can be at peace just by yourself, basically in solitary confinement, right? That's basically what like a lot of Zen masters did. Like Bodhidharma going and living in a cave for 9 years, just facing the cave wall. It's like voluntarily exposing yourself to like 9 years of solitary confinement. It's kind of insane. But then you think about, it's like, what if you had the power, even if somebody were to place you into solitary confinement, to basically like have this whole like world to explore in your head or whatever. Someone says, do you still meditate after you're turning your back on Buddhism? I do not. Although I've found meditation, when you like start to dig deep on meditation, you learn that there's all sorts of different kinds of meditation. And I explored all sorts of different kinds of meditation to see which ones would be the most effective. And I wasn't just looking for like, some people, they start meditating, they want to, it's like exercise for their brain. They want to be more compassionate in their daily life, or be able to take a step back from their emotions, or whatever, something like of that, make themselves more creative and cooperative and industrious members of society, right? And then some people are looking for meditation because they're like, I want to break through this veil of reality and understand the secret truths of the universe or something like that. And that was more the kick that I was on. And I found that Watu meditation, Korean Watu meditation, that's like their, I think it's called Tien, is like their version of Zen. I might be wrong about that. That's where you just repeat like one word or one phrase over and over again in your head, and you can do that kind of throughout the day. And that with the Jiaoju's dog koan really like kind of blew my mind, I guess, or I would say gave me some sort of spiritual insights. And then other than that, just doing like mantra meditations and breath meditations did help me like understand some things about myself and my own psychology. But at a certain point, I kind of recognized it. The reason why I stopped doing it is mainly because I don't think I need it for the ability to like take a step back and rein in my emotions or whatever. I've never been that, like, that's never been a problem for me. And then since I realized it's not really a path to enlightenment, I don't really need to do it anymore. And I was kind of thinking about it at a certain point, and I'm like, okay, this all goes back to Nietzsche, guys, because it's like, are we going to live as though we're already dead so that we can live, right? Does that make any kind of sense? Are we going to voluntarily put ourselves in the state of solitary confinement with the expectation that that could happen to us one day and we need to be prepared for when it does? A lot of religion is people trying to argue their way out of death, or like find some way of, I don't know, being ready for when death happens. Of like, oh, I need to be prepared. Death is coming. I can't avoid it. I need to live in such a way or have some sort of answer to death when it happens so that it doesn't really happen, right? Like either there's an afterlife and I've believed the right things, or I've taken care of my karma or what have you. And I think there's a whole attitude in life. You hear this a lot from Jordan Peterson. You know, like, great suffering and calamities and tragedies are going to happen to you. They will. So you have to be prepared. You have to armor yourself with faith or morality, having lived a moral and just life, or whatever it might be, so that when the calamity comes, you'll be ready for it, right? And I think Nietzsche's attitude is encapsulated in that passage from, I want to say it's The Gay Science, where he says, it makes me happy that the people don't spend all their time thinking about death. He's sort of people watching in a sense. It's at the time when he's in Genoa, he's in northern Italy, and he's sort of walking around and he's saying he's living in this jumble of little lanes and all these people going in their different directions doing their thing, and a lot of philosophical types and ascetic priestly types and people like probably us, the people watching this video, we tend to look down on the average people who don't think about all of the big existential issues, right? I mean, that's sort of like it's a source of superiority that you get when you're, especially when you're a teenager or you're a 20-something and you first read like Cioran and Schopenhauer and Ligeti and stuff, and suddenly you know these pessimistic truths, and look at all those cows out there with their happiness, right? It's like the point of Downward Spiral by Nine Inch Nails, right? You're all a bunch of pigs, you're just eating and consuming, whereas I know the real truth about how the world works and how awful it is, and so I'm enlightened enough to be depressed and cynical about everything, right? So where was I going with that? So Nietzsche is sort of going against that sentiment of, I'm so above all of these, people who don't know these existential hard truths. Look at them. They're just doing their thing. They're just going to work, raising a family. They're not thinking about death. I mean, maybe they are. Nietzsche, they can't read people's minds, right? But he's sort of saying, he does. He concludes it. He says, it makes me happy that people don't want to think about death. And I would, if I could do anything, it would be to make the thought of life 1,000 times more appealing to them. And so that's kind of my shift in perspective from Buddhism, is like, yeah, tragedy and death and suffering will come to everybody. Why would you spoil all of the time that you have on this earth where you actually are healthy and can have wonderful, exhilarating, exciting experiences in life? Because one day it'll come to an end, so I need to be ready for that. So I'm going to poison all the moments of happiness that I have now. It actually is rather destructive to our entire experience of life. And so when Nietzsche talks from my old friend Scam Likely, it hung up on them there. But all these sort of attempts at being prepared to die and to pass on to the other world, what that's doing, there's another passage where Nietzsche says that the brevity of life could be sweeten every aspect, every experience we have in life like a drop of honey. But instead, you apothecaries and poison mixers have turned it into the bitterest pill that we all have to swallow. So that's why my attitude changed. So I'm not going to spend my time sitting around meditating, which is basically doing nothing, being passive, just examining my mind, completely turning inward. Why would I do that now? I've moved beyond the need to do that because I'm no longer looking for anything. Brevity is the soul of wit, Gluon says. That's a Shakespeare quote, I believe. Okay, now, somebody asked about human all too human. God, I'm such a boomer when it comes to this, guys, so let me see. It was Gluon as well, about human all too human based on your... That's a tough one. Okay, so what I tell people when they're struggling with any philosophical text, go slowly and look up words that you don't know, is the sort of the basic. Those are the first say. Well, which edition do you have? Maybe Gluon will tell me. Do you have the Helen Zimmern translation? That's usually the one that people find. I think there's a Cambridge edition. I don't know if Caro Molinari produced a version, but in any case, what you're going to get at the beginning usually, which I don't know if every edition is going to contextualize it properly, is Nietzsche's preface that he wrote like a long time after Human All Too Human, where then he talks about the book as a convalescence, is what he says. So he calls it like a process of getting well after a long illness. And so it's basically like he added these prefaces to all of his works, like Human All Too Human, books 1, 2, and 3, Daybreak. I don't think he did it to the Gay Science, but he added a 5th book to the Gay Science. This was like 1886, 1887. He also added one to Birth of Tragedy. It's the one that Walter Kaufmann says is like one of the best things Nietzsche ever wrote, is his self-criticism in Birth of Tragedy. So you have to keep in mind that the preface you're reading when you start out in Human All Too Human, if you're reading that preface, it's sort of like Nietzsche retrospectively talking about what he wrote before. And actually, for a modern reader, it might not actually be that informative. I remember that it kind of lost me when I first picked up Human All Too Human, and like, what is he talking about? And then I understood, oh, this is from much later, and he's trying to like contextualize this within his whole canon. I would just say skip immediately to the text, because I think a lot of it is fairly self-explanatory, and I think also not self-explanatory, because I know you're saying you're struggling with it, but that you don't need any background in where Nietzsche's coming from, what he's doing. Just understand it's the beginning of his philosophical project in the middle period. He hasn't created a lot of his grand ideas yet, so you don't need to be familiar with any of those. Just jump right in. This is the beginning of Nietzsche's philosophizing, and it starts with a critique of metaphysics. And so the critique, okay, he has the intro by J.M. Kennedy, a preface by Nietzsche in 1886. So I would say maybe read the intro. Usually a translator's introduction is pretty informative about the book, about like the overall themes and stuff. I would maybe skip the preface by Nietzsche, because I don't think it's as essential to understanding Human All Too Human. And I would say just understand the beginning of it. He's sort of playing with and critiquing and examining a lot of our epistemological, metaphysical ideas about truth, ideas about reasoning, ideas about logic. That's where you get his idea. And he basically is, what he's driving at throughout the whole first book of Human All Too Human is this idea that philosophers up until now have had this congenital defect where they take what's near, what appears to them in the moment, in the now, in their historically contingent perspective. They look at that and they think that that is an absolute truth or an enduring truth or a transcendent truth. And so that's really where Nietzsche's driving from. And he says the other really interesting thing about the first book is that we need a chemistry of concepts and feelings. We need something that's never happened before, basically, it's something he's driving out with the gay science, right, of an artistic science, an artistic Socrates. And he sort of comes to it in psychology, maybe, but that's what it's really a more philosophical version of psychology than what we have today, right? Is kind of what Nietzsche's looking for, is an understanding of not just all of our thoughts, our conceptual world that we have in philosophy, but our feelings and sentiments and how they interplay and create, the worldviews that we have and the world that we live in, right? Because, as he says in the beginning of that book, we see by means of our human head and can't cut it off, and one wonders what would remain of the world if it had been cut off, right? It's sort of Schopenhauerian idealism in a sense, but in a really important way, he's saying there's actually no true world beyond that when you cut the human head off, right? Or just get rid of that notion. He wouldn't fully articulate that at that point, but he's already looking at things from that perspective, that the world we live in is irreducibly human. We get it through all of our senses. We can't break out of that with some sort of intelligible world or facts that somehow transcend the grounding and limitation of those five senses and that engagement we have with the world. Let's see here. Somebody else has asked something. Somebody says they like my hair. Thank you. I have not read Denial of Death. Do you think Socrates laid the groundwork for Christianity and that justice is for the weak, etc.? It's Nietzsche's argument. Can you do an explanation for the third chapter of Genealogy of Morals? I basically did that in the episode on the saint. It's the meaning of ascetic values on earth. What is the meaning of ascetic values on earth? Cruelty directed inward. Venting your ressentiment or your ability to, or I shouldn't say ability, your tendency, your need to discharge your power on the world and onto external opponents and dominate and control space and fight and conquer and all that. The priest basically takes that and redirects it inward. In times of war, or in times of peace, a warlike man turns upon himself, right? That's what the priest shows us all how to do. And so the ascetic gains power by doing this, right? It sort of relates to what we were talking about as regards the, what somebody asked earlier with meditation in Buddhism. So living an ascetic life where you subsist on, like, let's talk about Buddhist monks. They have to wear, like robes of just like discarded fabrics usually, or of just like one very rough form of material. They eat like grains or maybe some veggies if they're lucky, and they wash themselves in cold water. They don't have any entertainment or distractions or money or anything like that. And they basically they have this power though, because they've renounced everything in the world. And I brought this up in the conversation with Mina, the incident where Master Huangbo, this priest, gets to slap around the emperor. The emperor comes and asks him some questions. They're kind of gotcha questions about Buddhism, and Huangbo just slaps him. Now, Zen masters are known for just slapping people when they ask questions, but this is the emperor. He could technically be like, guards, stab him to death, right? So why does Huangbo have that power? Nietzsche's argument is that all ascetics sort of gain that power in the way that Diogenes has a sort of gains respect out of Alexander, right? He looks at this guy who lives among dogs, who lives among filth, who doesn't care anything for worldly pleasure or advancement, and this guy is willing to say, well, I don't want anything from you, just get out of my sunlight, right? That's really the meaning of what Diogenes is saying, is that the sun is something that nature gave him. It's not anything any man can give him or take away, right? All of the advancement that's promised to him through the ways of the world don't really measure up to what the sun can give him, right? And because that's so far from where most people's heads are at, the priest appears like this crazy figure. Like, how could you just be fine renouncing all worldly pleasures? That's what I live for, right? That's what the average person, the homo economicus, the man who lives by a trade, lives for. And so the saint appears to be this figure that's beyond humanity. That's how he gains his power. But it's by this sort of psychological mechanism that's kind of sick, right? He's able to the whole process by which the saint gains that power over himself and the power to renounce everything and sacrifice and have that virtue is by getting a feeling of power by mastering himself and tyrannizing over himself and being cruel to himself, by turning the outer struggle inward. And it gives him this whole, what would you say, melodrama, or this whole dramatic story that he can play out within himself, right? As he battles with his own animal urges and can translate it, like in the Christian framework, if we want to go over then to the Western side of things, to then put it into the language of a battle between sin and holiness, right, within himself. And so that's the explanation of the priest. So even though I started out by saying I've already answered that in another video, there it is for everybody. I think you are penitent in nature, which don't necessarily mean, actually derived from Christianity, but it would include Buddhism. It would include Islam's kind of a gray area, actually. I do want to talk a little bit more about Islam in the podcast, because it is like, in one of Nietzsche's notes, he talks about sort of the image of Muhammad as the what does it say about the religion of Islam, that their central holy figure is like a conqueror with a sword in his hand, right? He's not the son of God. He's not the just man who was to death. That's the Christian view. He's not the guy who renounced being a great king, all this worldly power, like the Buddha, and went to go live as an ascetic. He's not like these prophets who speak truth to power, like out of the Jewish canon. He's not even really. We might have something a little bit similar in Hinduism, that there are like warrior deities and things of that nature. But yeah, the thing is, there's still that whole like play of morality and asceticism within, I would say, Islamic spirituality as well, because the whole thing is based on like sacrifice and renunciation in some large part, because every human desire is sort of regulated, and what would you say? Every eventuality of human relationships are supposed to be placed underneath this organizing framework of the Sharia. So, and it's very interesting because Muslims don't have this idea of man as originally sinful like Christians do. So people are basically good and evil, and it's not expected. Like, you could actually have a good person in Islam, right? It's another aspect that Nietzsche might like, because in Christianity, and I know there might be New Agey or Unitarian Universalist versions of Christianity where they don't say this, and they might not emphasize this, but in Christianity, there's no such thing as a good person. Like, a lot of people don't really grasp that. Like, they'll kind of make reference to this in their preaching of like, look, this is why you need Jesus, because no matter how good you are, you can't ever measure up to God, though, or sinless like Jesus is. They're just chosen. That's actually a very important point to a lot of Christians, right? Of like why. This goes all the way back to the divine right of kings, but there's even some people in like evangelical Christianity who kind of conceive of things like this now, that even if the ruler is ostensibly evil, you should still follow him. You should still, follow the law of the land and not rebel against, the person that God has put in charge. Because even if they might be evil, they were still chosen to rule, right? So, whereas Islam, when they reevaluate all of the canon of, the Torah and the Christian Bible and so on, Solomon can be a good person. He could be a wise, God-fearing man. Why not? He's not originally sinful. We have somebody, Ahmed Elnagar. I was a Muslim before. You can ask me anything you like. Is what I said true? I don't talk to a lot of Muslims, but I'm going to ask to verify whether what I said was true after I already said it. But if you would just like put that forward, is that an accurate, in your view, assessment of the difference between Islam and Christianity, that you actually could have a quote unquote a good person in Islam? Obviously, they're not going to be as good as Muhammad, but it's not this idea everyone is like. What is it? Irrevocably sinful, basically, is the thing about Christianity. As good as you are, you can never kind of escape from that. Okay, good. He says that's true. That's good. Because I don't like to spread misinformation, harmful misinformation, right? Okay, let's see some other questions that we have here. Um, Currently studying English at university, and the academic atmosphere is extremely suppressive. Do you think we're living in a time of moral fanaticism? Yes. And that doesn't surprise me that the atmosphere is extremely suppressive, because they're not teaching you how to think, right? They're teaching you how to perform a technical function within a system or an institution. Um, did you study philosophy in university? No, I did not. Actually, well, I mean, I did. I studied it. But I didn't finish. So, yeah. Oh, we have somebody else. Jabran Ali Babri says, yeah, you're born pure according to Islam. Yeah, the reason why I looked into this recently is because we're going to cover, it'll be a while before this gets onto YouTube, but on the RSS feed in like 2 weeks or so, we're going to have an episode on the Mukhadima, I think is how it's pronounced, by Ibn Khaldun, who is a philosopher of history from North Africa and from the Arab world. And he talks about this, how people have a natural disposition that is not, that basically turn people away from what he sees as the good, as morality, right, according to his faith in Islam. And so it led me to look into that idea a little bit more, of that sort of that difference, because ever since St. Augustine, Christians have had this idea, which I don't even know, messages that seem to promote Calvinism or that seem to promote the idea that people actually do have free will in Christianity, kind of depending on which ones you want to live or way you want to go. Heidegger and his takes on Nietzsche. I don't know enough about Heidegger's takes on Nietzsche to really comment on the whole of it. What I will say is, like, I've seen a lot of, I've got a close friend, his name, Quinn Williams, he was on the show. He really likes Heidegger and his interpretations of Nietzsche, and we've discussed it, and there are times when I think Heidegger's correct, and there's times when I think he's incorrect. Mainly what I've studied with Heidegger is his take on the pre-Platonic philosophers versus Nietzsche's. And he's one of those people that seems to have the ability to, well, two things that I really don't like about a lot of philosophers, actually. Heidegger seems to have the ability, rather straightforward ideas, and put them into language. So we'll call that like a Hegelian style defect. And he also has that sort of Deleuzian style tendency, where sometimes I read what Heidegger's interpretation of a given philosopher is, and I'm like, that seems like but the opposite of what a surface level reading of what they said. And that mainly I'm thinking about like Heraclitus there. So I don't know. I need to get more into Heidegger, which I'm planning to do next season. I'm probably not going to just jump into being in time. I'm probably going to do, like his commentaries on like Greek philosophers and Nietzsche. Another question from, well, let's see. There was another one before that. Ibn Khaldun, another great historian, like Heraclitus, also worked on Indian history. Is al-Biruni. His work may interest you too. Interesting. Okay, al-Biruni. Somebody says the free will debate is hard to grasp, and my believes we do not have free will in totality, but have some form of agency. What is you in that question? What are you calling you? Like, are you calling it your ego consciousness? Because that's not in control in Nietzsche's view. What you are is a body, basically. It's funny. Another sort of contrast with Buddhism here, because Buddhism says you have no self. And there's the 5 aggregates, as you may know. What do we have? Like consciousness, perception, the physical form, sensation. I'm going to forget all of these. That's what happens when you don't study for a long time. But they basically say none of these can be yourself. They all are there. Yourself is an aggregate out of these 5 things that are not identical, right? They don't form an identity because in some way you've just aggregated them together and said that this is myself. but any one of them could change, and it doesn't change the nature of what your self is, right? And so a Buddhist would point out something, and that really the relevant thing is talking about physical form, about the body, right? So a Buddhist would point out something like, if somebody hacks off your arm, that doesn't mean you're not who you are anymore if your body is altered, right? Your body goes through sickness, old age, and death, and does that alter who you are? And I would simply say the Buddhists are wrong about that. Yeah, it alters who you are. Like if you're Phineas Gage and you get a railroad spike through your head or whatever it was that happened through him, it will alter your personality. It alters the physiology of your brain. And when you grow old and die, yeah, you will not be here anymore. What you are will be dead. And so that this idea is really based on the idea yet again, oh, well, I must be something beyond this body because this body is impermanent. And it's that Parmenidean idea that what is true, what is real, is what is, not what was and not what will be, but what is. And so what is the only thing that's really truly real. It must have some permanence to it in order for what you are to be truly real. Otherwise, it's just like a fleeting phenomenon. The problem is, for this view, what if we are a fleeting phenomenon? And to me, that's what it looks like, right? And to me, when I do think about like, what is myself? I'm like, well, the body, that's what contains everything that I am, is my physical form. And we always want to try and make it out something outside of the physical form because of that same fear over the impermanence of the physical form. But if what I am is a body, there's no problem for me. I don't have to aggregate anything more, right? I don't have to say that it's all these aggregates of things. I can say all of those other things derive from the body. The body is actually the core thing. Consciousness, perception, sensation, all of these things derive from. And again, do I know that for certain? No. I've kind of gotten over the absolute certainty thing. I think that's a red herring. And I'm really more interested whenever somebody says, well, how do you know? Because the channel started to grow in views recently, and I'm getting a lot of views on or comments on older videos where I've made some claims about consciousness and the physical nature of consciousness, and people will say, how do you know that? What's your evidence? And to me, I'm like, well, this is just what I observe. If you have some more information, I'd personally love to hear it. The problem is whenever we get into that kind of argument, it ends up being like faith-based claims or just sort of that spooky, well, you don't know, who knows? And I'm like, yeah, who knows? Exactly. So you should go with maybe go with what's immediately in front of your face. Maybe go with what everything your instincts tell you, right? That like where your existence seems to live is in this locality, in this flesh, and the things that you can touch and feel are the limits of your sense perception and so on. So a couple of people are asking, the world would be a better place if we stop believing in the wrath of a God who needs sacrifice to appease him. The world would be a better place if we stop believing the wrath of a God who needs a sacrifice to appease him. I don't know, honestly. I think a lot of people already have stopped believing in that, and it's not entirely clear that it makes them better people. I think it's also on the other side of that coin. I think Nietzsche's correct that less and less people believe that. I also think that the God that most people believe in, they like to imagine is not wrathful or demanding of sacrifices. But it's usually based on some sort of superstition or metaphysics or morality that sort of implicitly contains that element of it. I mean, you could even say with Jesus or with Christianity, right? The fact that people want there to be, whoa, ground sliding underneath me. Impermanence, right? Everything changes and shifts. The fact that people want there to be things like justice in the afterlife, right? They want everyone who's harmed people or done anything bad to get their just desserts. Well, that's sort of believing in a wrathful God, right? That towards like a quote unquote good end. But as long as our morality is still based on like recompensing harms with making people suffer, which is still what a lot of people believe. Go to any Reddit comment section about any news story where somebody did something bad, like hurt a child or cheated on their partner or anything like that, and just look at the Reddit comment section and you'll have people like calling for their deaths and their torture executions and types of medieval torture executions that we haven't done in hundreds of years, and you can find people on any internet comment section if somebody did something bad enough calling for it. So what does that tell you? I mean, people wonder, how could people have supported that when it was happening? It's like, well, that's why it's still inside of you today. So, as long as people still have that morality, they're going to have like sort of some sort of conception of a wrathful God, so to speak, right? Or at least it'll be like natural to them to think that that's what God thinks. As long as they have this moralized, that's no, he's not. What do you think of Nietzsche's view of the Indian caste system? Nietzsche's view of the Indian caste system is kind of funny. So he's got some passages where he says, it's like in praise of the Manu Law book, where he's like, it's the same sort of mistake that Christianity made and the same mistake that Buddhism made, making the ascetic the highest type, right? All the problems that come with that we discussed earlier in this little talk here. Since you mentioned that, what did Nietzsche think about suicide? I don't recall that Nietzsche writes about suicide all that much. I mean, I think he says that there's justice in which we take a man's life. There's justice in that we take a man's life, but there's no justice in that we take a man's death. So that's sort of like not about suicide itself. It's about like the legality of it, that Nietzsche thinks clearly suicide should be legal. Because what right do you have other than the right to decide whether you go on living or not? He also has that famous passage that the thought of suicide is a great consolation, and that by means of it one could get through many a hard night. So having the thought, having the option there, he thinks might be a good thing. Maybe it could induce you to be an inducement to life, actually, in some sense. And I have experienced that as well, like reading really depressive authors and really depressing ideas and cynical takes on human life. It gives you the ability to like sort of pass through the fire, so to speak, right? You identify with this totally like world-denying perspective and just stare the abyss right in the face. But then when you come out on the other side, you sort of survive it. It allows you to feel as though you've transcended it, right? The idea, I've gotten pleasure from looking at the most depressing, nihilistic ideas, embracing those ideas. It sort of sets you above it or beyond it in some sense. So the actual act of suicide out of like depression or nihilism or something like that, I don't think Nietzsche would support that. But then again, he might say that there's some people that actually do have no reason to live. There might actually be a reason for them to commit suicide. Now that I've talked about suicide, I will probably have to cut this out of the like final version of the stream, because it's not going to be allowed to be monetized, I would guess. But no advocacy for anything here. If you need help, get help. I have to say all that shit. I'm just talking about what is in actual Nietzsche's books. Okay, so there you have it, in my view. And then a couple more questions. Next season, do you think amour fati is just a coping mechanism like stoicism? I mean, yeah. I guess it depends on what you call a coping mechanism. Because amour fati in some way is like saying later. That's like a famous saying. They even get the masks, the two masks of comedy and tragedy tattooed to show you laugh when you're young and you're living the life, and then later you go to prison or you get killed and you cry, right? Is that a coping mechanism? I don't know. It's like what you're trying to cope with is like really your fear of the future by just saying, let me enjoy it now. It's sort of the same underlying attitude. I don't know that it actually helps you when tragedy strikes, because then you would just sort of be forced to say, yeah, well, here's the time to cry, right? And so is it really like a cope at that point, right? Usually like a coping mechanism is something that you employ when you're in times of strife and pain and suffering in order to make yourself mentally feel better about it. Whereas it seems like amour fati, let me love my fate. I don't know. Maybe somebody could bring that sort of to their mind when something, calamitous is happening to them, when they're struggling in some way. And this is just another fate that I have to love. But to me, that seems to require a lot of willpower, right? I think the more common thing is that people say amour fati when the going's good, and then when the going gets tough, suddenly their Christian sensibilities reemerge. So, let me see here. Preface to Birth of Tragedy, that's probably how you will end, is let's see here. Japanese samurai idea of suicide is interesting. It doesn't stem from nihilism or escape. Yeah, I mean, that's it's sort of like a duty, right? That's more suicide in the sense of like, you know, that Slayer song, Mandatory Suicide, right? That's when your commanding officer orders you to go charge and take that hill in a war, and knowing good and well that it's probably like a suicide charge, or like in World War I, right? Go charge the enemy trench. You know, like, is that suicide? Kind of, in a way it is, right? If you know, like, barring a miracle, if I do this, I'm going to die. You know, we normally exclude things where people are serving their country, or, you know, out of a duty, it's something in the line of duty, right? We usually exclude that from calling it suicide. So, I don't know. It's, you could see seppuku as sort of the same thing, right? There's that story by Yukio Mishima called Patriotism. That's basically about a Japanese general who, when Japan surrenders in World War II, a bunch of the generals are like, we can't tolerate this, we need to overthrow the emperor. And then they fail, and they're like, well, the only honorable thing for us at this point, because the emperor's been dishonored, the empire has been dishonored, and the empire has rejected our offer to basically rescue it, you know, that is, the only way out is suicide, basically, is seppuku. And that this is a form of patriotism. This is a form of actually being true to who and what we are. And our country is die with dignity, because the old country is going away, right? There's a scene in Star Trek, the original series, where this is in the mirror universe, where the Federation is evil. So they're not a union of planets helping other planets and trying to create this big NATO-like, EU-like superstructure in the galaxy. They're just going around conquering and colonizing people. And they come to these people who are total pacifists, who have a bunch of, like, dilithium. It's basically like the fuel they need for their starships. And they say, give all of this to us. And these people are like, no, we're pacifists. And we're pacifists even in the sense that if our actions indirectly lead to even the taking of one life, it's like a hideous evil in our society. And we have to preserve who and what we are. So, and they're basically, the argument that Kirk gives them is like, well, you'll be destroyed if you resist us. And what he says is to preserve what we are. So could you be destroyed to preserve what you are? To maintain your moral integrity, or die for what you believe in, right? Is that suicide? Is it suicide if you die to preserve what you are? I don't know. That's a question. Okay, so a couple other questions. Is having 2/3 of the day possible today? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Just it's fine. I think I talked about this with someone else on the